name is Dan Lynch, and I'm with the Pennsylvania Game Commission, and today is a study session for the wildlife section of the Envirothon. We're hoping that this type of study session will help you in both the county and the state, especially for those schools that aren't able to get a wildlife conservation officer to come out to your program. We're going to try to do this online so that everybody gets the same information. First segment we're going to start with is the wildlife identification. And so we're going to start by talking about some of the pelts, talking about some of the characteristics of these animals. And all of these will be related to the wildlife notes, which are available online on the website, on the Game Commission website. So I'm going to start by talking about the otter. And the otter, along with the rest of these, is a very common animal that we have here in Pennsylvania. The first five animals are members of the weasel family, and that includes the otter. The otter is mostly a semi-aquatic animal, and you'll be able to see the difference between some of the furs of this animal versus a terrestrial animal like the foxes or the coyote. So this guy is a predator, and he's a very important member of the food chain. He's got very short, dense fur, which allows him to stay in the water a lot. He is also a game animal. So we have a trapping season for otters. We've had it for about 3 years now. It's on a very limited basis, but it is important to know that this animal will be listed in the Pennsylvania Game Commission Digest as a game animal. Next member of the weasel family that we're going to talk about is the mink. And all of these animals are, for the most part, are considered fur bearers. The mink is a very, very common animal. This one in particular is in a brown phase, but you will also many times see white on the chin and a little bit on the chest. And you can also find mink in Pennsylvania as a completely black fur bearer. And there's a trapping season on mink as well. And he's just another member of the predators that we have here in Pennsylvania. Just underneath the size of the mink is another member, and this is a weasel. We have 3 weasels in Pennsylvania. This one is considered the long-tail weasel, and he happens to be in what we call an ermine phase. And an ermine phase just means that he's simply white. This guy has a little bit of brown on him, and he has a black tip on the tail. One of the characteristics or adaptations that this animal has for survival is a black tip on the tail. And because when he's running around in the snow, and a predator like an owl or a hawk is focusing in on him, they're focusing in on the black tip as he's running along the snow. So if he happens to get grabbed on the talons of any bird of prey by the tip of the tail, he will probably survive, as opposed to if he had a black tip on his nose, he would probably not make it. So this is a not so common member, but he's not endangered or anything like that. He's just not as common that people get to see weasels. This animal, also a member of the weasel family, is becoming more and more common in Pennsylvania. He's spreading out to all 67 counties in Pennsylvania. He's not quite there yet, but he's being seen all over the place. This is a fisher, and some people call him a fisher cat, but that's kind of confusing because people think they're somehow cat related. They're not related to a cat at all. This is a member of the weasel family. This particular one is not as, probably maybe 3/4 the size of an adult male. So an adult male would be slightly bigger than this. Many times they're much more brown, but they all have that same tubular shape. With the otter, the fisher, and the weasels, they're all very similar in their shape. However, you'll see that the fisher, compared to the otter, has a much longer, denser coat, so it's not going to spend very much time in the water. So this guy will be found in the woods, usually in areas with a lot of pine trees, because one of their main food sources are squirrels. It's also the only animal in Pennsylvania that actively will eat a porcupine. And that's a good tip to know for a good Envirothon question. What animal would actively feed on a porcupine would be this guy. And so they have to injure that porcupine, and because they have to eventually get him in the neck or the chest, which is the only place that he doesn't actually have any quills. So I'm sure it's a very difficult thing to do, but it is the only animal that will actually feed on them. When you see these animals, they're normally in a loping pattern, so their back is up in the air. And that's normally what people see on any of the weasels, the otter, the weasel, and the mink, is they have this loping pattern when they run. So those are the 4 members of the weasel family. This particular one was also considered that at one time a member of the weasel family, but it's not really. This is one that you really should know for lots of reasons. But this is a striped skunk. We have 2 skunks in Pennsylvania, the striped skunk and the spotted skunk. Spotted skunk is very, very limited to probably southern Franklin County, where this guy is found in all 67 counties. You don't always see them with stripes. Sometimes it's a single stripe. Sometimes the skunk is all white. Sometimes the skunk is all black. But in most parts of Pennsylvania, you're going to find the striped skunk. This animal has a great defense mechanism. On the underside of the tail by the anal vent, it's got 2 little glands back there. It can squirt about a ½ ounce of liquid, about 16 feet in a cone, and it's a great defense mechanism. Normally, if you're around skunks, if you just talk very, very calmly to them, they won't get really excited, but the minute you see that tail going up in the air, you know there's a problem. So this is a very common animal that we have in Pennsylvania, and a good one to make sure that you know about. We'll talk next about the 3 canines that we have in Pennsylvania. And all of these are actually very common. This is probably the most common one, found in all 67 counties, and this is the red fox. Red fox, some of their characteristics, obviously you've got this red coat, but it's much more prevalent in the fall and the winter. In the spring and the summer, it's kind of a brownish, dull red color. And one of the other indicators of red versus any of the other canines is normally this little white tip on the tail. Some have a nice, big, large white tip. Some just have a few white hairs on there, but that's usually an indicator. This one's a little hard to see, but his ears are the back side of his ears are black. Some people think that's a characteristic of, because this guy's not a very big animal, maybe 10 or 12 pounds, when he's out in the middle of the field, if something is looking at him from behind, they see the black on those ears and think that it might be eyes, so they think he might be looking at them, which might be a characteristic that would keep this animal alive. He's a very timid animal. He's going to eat very small prey, mice, rabbits, squirrels, voles, shrews, insects, fruit. So this guy's an omnivore. He'll eat both meat and plants. All of the canines are. But he's very, very common in Pennsylvania. His cousin would be the gray fox. Also pretty common, however, has a little bit, his characteristics of where he would like to live is more of a wooded environment, which has to do with his salt and pepper camouflage. He's not going to blend real well out in the middle, out in a field, but in the woods and the shadows, he would have a great camouflage pattern. Normally, an adult gray fox is slightly smaller than an adult red, but you're always going to have those individual species that might be a little bit bigger. This guy the gray fox has a much smaller track, and he's got a lot of hair in between the toes, so it's very hard many times when you're seeing a track in the snow or the mud to actually pick out the actual toe and claw imprints. One characteristic that the gray has that the red doesn't have, or the coyote, or the other canine, is the ability to climb trees. So the gray fox is very adept at climbing trees, not like a raccoon. He can't go straight up a tree, but he'll go on an angled tree, low branches, for a couple of reasons. One, he's very small, 8 to 10 pounds, could be eaten by a larger predator. 2, he's got a great advantage from being up there. He can see prey in different areas. And 3, he likes to eat birds and bird eggs. So if he can get up in that tree, he can find another food source that the other canines can't get. So there's no competition with him. So we do have gray foxes, probably in 65 of the 67 counties. I would say that in extreme southeast, there may not be too many, simply because too many people, not enough wooded habitat. Last canine that we have in Pennsylvania is the coyote. And coyote is very common, found in all 67 counties. This guy, a very large coyote, would probably go in the 45, 50-pound range, but normally they look a lot bigger than they really are. They have a very thick coat and very little fat on them at all. So really, they normally don't weigh as much as most people think that they do. They just have a nice, really thick coat, which makes them look much bigger than they really are. This guy can come in a lot of different varieties of coat color. This one happens to be a gray or a German Shepherd type color, which is pretty common. But you will see them with this all brown. you'll see them a reddish phase, kind of like the red fox, black, blonde, all different coat colors. They adapt very well to living around people, so it's very common to see coyotes in and around towns and houses. They'll eat just about anything. They are an omnivore, so everything from a field mouse to a white-tailed deer is on the menu. They also obviously forage on a lot of dead animals found along the road, and in that way they don't have to expend a lot of energy. All the predators will do that to get their next food source. Normally when you see a coyote walking around, one of the other characteristics is that the tail is normally straight out. If the tail's curled around, that's normally a domestic dog that you're looking at. But normally a straight out tail or straight down tail is normally a characteristic more of a coyote. So those are the three canines that we have. So a couple of the more semi-aquatic species that we have, this guy is probably one of the most common, and this is a muskrat. He would have a long rat-like tail that has black bristly hairs on it. The tail is kind of flattened, and muskrats are herbivores, very, very common, found somewhere along streams and ponds in Pennsylvania. Normally you're going to see a little bit of mud coming out of a hole where they're going in and out of the hole, or if you're walking along the creek, you put your foot down into one of their holes that they've excavated. So this is a very, very common animal. It's also an excellent food source for a lot of other animals in Pennsylvania. All part of the food chain is having a lot of muskrats. This one is one that leaves a lot of sign. So we'll be talking a little bit later about some sign, and they leave a lot of their droppings around on prominent places as a signpost to other muskrats that they're around. So this is a really good animal to look for sign of this animal. Similar to the muskrat is beaver, and this is a pretty decent sized pelt. All these other animals, when they're skinned, they're normally skinned whole, and they're kind of like just turned inside out, where the beaver is skinned out on a board or a wire hoop and opened up completely. So that's a pretty good indicator when you're looking at pelts, by the way, for the contest. If it's completely open like that, really good chance that that's a nice oval shape would be the beaver. Beaver has a really interesting coat. It has long guard hairs and a short, dense underfur. And this is the largest herbivore that we have in Pennsylvania. Second largest herbivore would be a porcupine. I do not have a porcupine pelt here, but that's a good test question. What's the largest herbivore in Pennsylvania? That's this guy. I would assume that this coat is probably from a beaver in the 45 to 50 pound range, but we get really, really big beavers in Pennsylvania up to high 60 pound range, which is really big for a herbivore. This guy will cut down a lot of trees. He's doing it for a couple of reasons. One, he's trying to get what's at the top of the tree. He's got hind web feet and he can't climb, so he's got to cut them down to get them down. He's going to eat the bark, he's going to eat the branches, or the very tips of the branches and the leaves. Then he's going to possibly use the rest of the tree and the branches that he doesn't eat to build a dam. There's only one reason beavers build dams, and that is they're trying to spread water out to their food source. They don't want to walk around on the land, they want to swim around in the water. So the more they can spread the water away from the stream, the more trees that are covered by water, they can then swim over to their food source and feel a lot safer when they're doing it. The beaver has a lot of adaptations. It has glands back by the tail where it can secrete one gland to identify a territory and another gland that it will squirt on its front paws, rub it all over its hair, and then use a split toenail on its hind foot to actually comb that oil throughout its hair to waterproof itself. We do the same thing with baseball gloves and new boots. We do the same thing by rubbing mink oil or beeswax or something into them, and beavers do the exact same thing to waterproof their hair, and they do it every single day. One animal that you will also find in and around the water and does do a lot of swimming, although the coat doesn't really remind you of that, the coat is much more terrestrial looking like a coyote, is the raccoon. And raccoon, a very common species that we have in Pennsylvania. Identifying characteristics would be what people call black mask, which is just black across the eyes, and a ringed tail. And this particular one is pretty dark on the belly, or dark on the back and light on the belly. You can find them a lot more silver tipped, where they would look much more grayer. but the raccoon is a very, very common species, living in just about every habitat that we have in Pennsylvania, and living around people, has absolutely no problem living around people, eating all kinds of food sources. We have a lot of animals that we consider a rabies vector, that is, animals that might possibly carry rabies more commonly than others, and that's this guy. So you just want to be careful handling any type of species here, but especially raccoons. Common critter about the same size as the raccoon and the skunk, ones that you'll find very, very common. This is a possum. Another good question is, what animal can you start with 2 different letters and have the exact same answer? And that's this guy. He's either an opossum or a possum. Both of them are correct, so you can start with an O or a P. Can't think of any other animal that you could do that with. The possum's pretty interesting. He is our only marsupial, and a marsupial is an animal that carries its young in a pouch. So if this was a female, she would have a pouch down here, and all of her babies that are born are premature. She can have 2 litters a year, somewhere in the neighborhood of 23 babies at a time. So she's very, very prolific. And this is an animal that benefits humans in a lot of ways. It's a carrion eater, which is carrion is dead things. So this guy spends a lot of time cleaning up dead things on the road, which is beneficial to the possum because it doesn't have to expend any energy to get them. The bigger hide here isn't a complete hide, but it does show the tail and the body and the belly being white. So this is a white-tailed deer, and the underside of the tail of a white-tailed deer is white. And usually its belly, its neck, and its chin, and up around its head has got some white on it. So the white-tailed deer is a Pennsylvania mammal and extremely common in all 67 counties. Also an animal that's very common or very adaptable to living around people, which is a good thing and a bad thing. We have a lot of damage by deer to a lot of different things, whether it's crops or problems in and around homeowners with flowers and things like that, and also hitting a lot on the road. So this is an animal that you will find in the Envirothon contest that we have a lot of questions about its management, so it's a good animal for the Envirothon because we talk a lot about white-tailed deer in Pennsylvania. Next critter is our only feline that we have in Pennsylvania, and this is the bobcat. This particular pelt is not super big. They get a lot bigger than this in Pennsylvania, but he's called a bobcat, A, because he's a cat, and B, because he's got what we call bobbed tail, short tail. And so we don't have cats in all 67 counties of Pennsylvania. They don't do real well living around people. So in those areas that are highly populated with people, you're going to have a lot less cats. They also prefer a more mountainous habitat as opposed to fields. And so you're going to be in those counties that have, a more mountainous area. You're probably going to find more cats in those habitats because they're more suitable to them. Unlike the canines that rush in and grab their prey, these guys are very, very meticulous, and they take their time when they're hunting. But they can kill things as large as a small deer, and they probably spend a lot more time on smaller prey. And they are carnivores, so they're rarely ever going to eat any plants of any kind. Most of the members that I've talked about so far have been omnivores. I should have mentioned that the weasel family, for the most part, are carnivores, and the cat. Other than that, pretty much everybody's either a herbivore or an omnivore, but there's very few carnivores that we have in Pennsylvania, but the bobcat is one of them. So I have one representative of the squirrel family here today is the gray squirrel. We have a few others. We have a flying squirrel, which is a much smaller squirrel. We have a red squirrel, very, very tiny and almost all red. And then we have a fox squirrel. And the fox squirrel is a little bit larger than the gray, and wherever the white is on the gray, it is a reddish brown. But the squirrel is a very common animal in all 67 counties, also a part of the food chain, a very important part of the food chain to a lot of species. And this animal has a characteristic, obviously, of bearing a lot of food, buries a lot of acorns and things that eventually, if they don't pick them up and find them again, help to regenerate a bunch of our forests in Pennsylvania. So it's actually a beneficial animal. Last two animals are pretty similar. This one is a little more common in all 67 counties, and that would be the cottontail rabbit. We have a lot of them. They're also a huge member of the food chain in Pennsylvania. Cottontails will have up to 5 or 6 babies in a year, and their first litter can have its first litter before spring's over, which is pretty amazing. So any animal that has a high birth rate also has a high mortality rate. So a lot of them are going to be eaten by other animals before they ever become adults. The member that's similar to that one would be the snowshoe hare. So a hare is different than a rabbit. When a hare is born, an H-A-R-E has H-A-I-R. So when a hare is born, it has hair. When a cottontail is born, it's a little pinky and completely helpless. This particular pelt is from a hare that is either transitioning to all white or going back to brown again. It has an extremely large hind foot, which is characteristic of them, and rather short ears for this is not a jackrabbit. This is just a snowshoe hare. So even though they have really large feet, they don't really have super large ears like an animal like a jackrabbit. But this is also an animal that's only found in certain counties of Pennsylvania. They're going to be in a more northern habitat, and they're going to be in an area that has lots of pine trees as well. Last animal that I have to talk about is Pennsylvania black bear. And we have a lot of black bears in Pennsylvania. It's a real interesting animal, also one that's seemingly spending a lot more time in and around people. Probably one of the most important parts of its management is teaching people how to live with bears. We have a lot of them. They rarely are a nuisance as long as you don't feed them. But when people go start feeding them, that's when they become a problem. But in Pennsylvania, we, prior to the hunting season, average somewhere around 19,000 bears in population, and we harvest somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 bears every year. And so in some areas, we have to harvest more of them because we have more bears around more people, and then we have bear-human conflicts. So we extend the hunting seasons in those areas in hopes to harvest more of those bears to try to cut down on the human-bear conflicts. So that's what we call a cultural carrying capacity. We have a biological carrying capacity in Pennsylvania where we could probably have 25 or 26,000 bears, no problem. Food source is there, the land is available, but we have too many people, and we end up with too many bear-human conflicts. So the black bear is an omnivore, probably spends more time eating plants than it does meat. Plants take less energy to catch, and so that's why they would spend more time doing that. And they're also have no problem eating anything that they find that's dead. So you think of all the roadkill deer and everything that we have in Pennsylvania, and there's an available food source in every county of Pennsylvania. Bears in Pennsylvania do really, really well. We average 3 cubs per sow, and 5 is more common than 1 in Pennsylvania, which is pretty amazing. In Alaska, they have more black bears than we do, but they average normally 1 cub. Where here in Pennsylvania, we average 3 cubs. And that's simply because the environment's not quite as hostile, and the food source is there. So we're going to have a lot more bears in Pennsylvania.